Welcome back to We Know Scripted TV, where today we know Silo, and we know Silo Season 2 is officially here. Episode 1, The Engineer, is in the books, and we spent a lot of time with one solitary engineer as we have a big follow-up on, of course, the major beat to end Season 1. It was only a short time ago last year, which is only a short amount of time in modern TV landscapes, that we saw Juliet Nichols go over that hill, but we are far from over the hill in terms of podcasting. In fact, we're brand new to covering Silo here on the Reno Scripted TV feed. And of course, I am not alone here, joined by somebody who would never rebuff me and say that the next time I podcasted with her, she would kill me, which makes me personally very excited because we're going to be covering Silo all season long here. It is the one, the only Grace Leeder.
Mike, I will podcast with you, but if you do try to enter my little room that I've built here, I will try to kill you. If you,
that is breaking and entering, so that does make sense. At least, I don't know how things are in Canada, but we have certainly some stand your ground laws here, and I don't know if that applies to an entire silo, as we'll see in this episode.
I would argue that there might not be any laws written about this other silo over there in the other location, so I feel like it's anarchy rules, Mike.
Yeah, so we are back with more coverage of Silo. Of course, I had the great pleasure of covering this with Dr. Amanda over on the post-show recap side of things last year. Grace and I last week did a big catch-up podcast where we talked about the concept of the show, reminded everybody, because it has been a while, even though it's been a little bit over a year, as to everything that's going on. And some of those story beats are going to be a bit deferred to the next episode, but our coverage will not be. We'll be here every Friday breaking down the newest episode of Silo on Apple TV+. Feel free to check us out. Make sure you're subscribed to WeKnowScriptedTV.com in both the podcast form and the video form. Also on We Know Scripted TV, you can check out some of our weekly shows like Grace and Taryn on the Tastemakers, like me and Sasha on TV for Real, or me and Josh doing Battlestar Galactica. Grace, you have some other coverage coming up that we can plug at the very end. And also, if you love your Apple TV sci-fi mystery shows in the lead up to Severance Season 2, which should be following Silo Season 2, we know that a rewatch podcast has started there. So we really have this generator humming right now on the Reno Scripted TV side, Grace. It is far from flooded, unlike the poor denizens of Silo 17.
I'm not going to wait till the end. If you're also watching Dune Prophecy, which will release this upcoming Sunday, we are doing recap coverage of Dune Prophecy. That is the Raised by Wolves crew, mother and father and someone, a third. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know which one of it.
3 tickets to challengers, please.
Tag yourself. Taryn Armstrong, Josh Wigler, and I are covering Dune, so check that out. That drops this Sunday. But I'm more excited right now to talk about the episode of Silo that we watched, Mike.
Yeah, so surprising in many ways. Silo is a show of surprises. And again, we talked about how they truly build a community within what has now been discovered as Silo 18 towards the end of Season 1. And we lead things, obviously, on a very calamitous precipice with Juliet defying any sort of laws and logic and, being able to go where no person has gone before upon being exiled from the Silo, goes over the hill and makes this game-changing discovery that they are not the only Silo out there. And so Graham Yost and company decide to dedicate the Season 2 premiere to really, much like her mother had an interest in once upon a time, kind of putting the magnifying glass in on one very specific portion of the story. We are dealing intensely, extremely, and solely with Juliet discovering the remnants of what ended up being, as we'll find out in the first 5 minutes, a Silo that underwent its own uprising and unfortunately led to a not so happy ending. Grace, turns out that the spark of revolution without oxygen just kind of gets snuffed out, quite literally. And so we get, I think, especially for a season premiere, I would say, a slower paced episode, as it really is a lot of Juliet kind of walking through a haunted house, a museum, a tomb. If you want to say Juliet does her best Laura Croft, we could put it there as well. She will find the lone denizen left over towards the end. But really, Grace, we spend our one episode of Silo this week focusing on one character in one place.
Yeah, if I had Juliet Nichols for every time I texted you during the episode saying, "Uh-oh, I think it might be a little boring," I'd have exactly one Juliet Nichols because I did do that.
And that was this episode too. Only one Juliet. Oh, I guess
One,
two if you count the past version of her.
yeah, a younger version of Juliet Nichols and an older version of Juliet Nichols. I do think, and not to kind of metagame very early, Mike, but I wonder whether or not that they thought that this episode was going to be released in tandem with episode 2, much like they did for season 1, because I think if you look at what happened this episode and what is coming based on the teaser trailer for next week's episode, I think it makes a lot of sense as a two-parter. I think that on its own, unfortunately, I think this episode just did not have a lot going on, enough to keep me warranted. I definitely found myself trying my best to be like, oh yeah, keep watching the show. Like literally, like I have my notes and I'm taking my notes, but I'm like, wandering a little bit, being like, what else is going on? And then I'm like, oh, I missed that. And I had to go back and I'd rewind and be like, oh, she like looked down at some water or something. It's like, I don't know. The thing for me is that I just thought that, I don't know if I'm here. I've seen this take a little bit of like, fine episode, doesn't make sense as a premiere. And I think that I agree, but I'm not even sure that there's enough there for, I think even if this episode was like episode 4 of the season, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I loved it. Loved the ending. The flashback scenes were fine in that there's more going on than what's going on in the present day. And I think that like thematically and all this stuff, there's a lot of stuff in this episode that I think like makes sense, but just didn't work for me as an episode of television, Mike. So I don't want to start up being like super, super negative because I was so excited for the show to return, but I do feel like I'm going to be a little bit negative on this episode, unfortunately.
I do completely agree with your metagame analysis that, of course, season 1 had episodes 1 and 2 back to back, which we talked about on our preview show, served as this really great way to get people into the world that, despite the fact that episode 1 is going to deal with 2 characters in the form of the Holstons who will not live basically to see it through the 3rd way mark of this season, that it still served as kind of like a nice passing of the torch and, introduction of the character of Juliet, who is obviously going to be our central focus. So yeah, I do wonder that, assuming next week is now going to go back to Silo 18 and really focus on all the fallout that comes from Juliet being able to go over the hill, that this would have made more sense as a 1-2 punch, and that maybe they assumed that Apple would have packaged it the same way, and that just ended up not being the case. I mean, I will also say, as like a dyed-in-the-wool Lost fan, this gave me huge season 2 Lost vibes.
Wool is the name of the book series, Mike, not the show.
Yeah, that's very true. Exactly. But the idea that maybe it's the fact that here's this like random long-haired man living by himself in an underground bunker, whether it's the fact that we ended with a bunch of characters scattered to the nines and now we're going to focus one episode primarily on them and then do a little bit of Rashomon filling in after the fact. And I've gone on the record many times to talk about how that wasn't my favorite sequence of events to start off season 2. I mean, I can understand the utility in it. It seems like, listen, Juliet ripped the heck out of that suit. It seems like she's not going to be leaving this silo in the near future, despite this man's protestations. And so it seems like this is going to be our secondary location for at least a good chunk of season 2. So it makes sense to kind of, for lack of a better term, silo its focus and be able to say, like, this is where we're going to live. I think it was a nice reminder of Juliet Nichols as a character, the fact that she is an absolute badass, and that it felt like we were basically watching dystopian MacGyver happen was very fun, with her ingenuity in building the ladder and then building the ladder back. It does, I think, again, come at the expense of maybe some expectations of like, okay, but what's happening with the other characters? I would say even the world building from within Silo 17, there are a couple things that are interesting, but I don't think it's particularly out of place to say, in my opinion, far and away the most interesting parts of the episode were the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes.
I totally agree, and I I saw a comment, I think, on Reddit that was talking about how this felt like watching a novel, and they were saying that in a very complimentary way. I think that I would say that, like, I feel that, and I think that if I was in the writer's room for the show and I'm looking at how do I end season one, I think it's a perfectly great place to end season one. I think that it makes sense as the endpoint of like Juliet Nichols leaving the silo and moving on. That's a great place to end. I think that the thing that's tough is that, like, in a novel, we can get Juliet's thoughts
That's exactly it. That's exactly
and
it.
can be expressed. And what I found the struggle of this episode was they tried to do that to give us some introspection, at least about what she might be thinking based on the flashbacks of when she's a kid, and finding this toy and deciding to fix it and all of this stuff in her relationship with Shirley. I just don't think it like works strong enough. So even there's a thing that like I eventually got there, but I'm like, oh yeah, of course, like the place being flooded and then her not, like, of course she can't swim. She's grown up in the silo. Like, so
Well, and we actually, it was established in season one that
that's
she was
right.
afraid of water, right? When
That's
she's
right.
like in the deep down with that big boring machine
That's
and
right.
like looking down at the dark pool of water beneath her.
Yeah, and so like it's all in there, and and again, I think if I'm in the writers' room, I think that if I start like moving stuff, they're like, oh no, that doesn't work for this reason, and so I actually think that like this might be the best version of the events that we kind of almost need to get through to get to the point where we're going to meet this guy, Steve Zahn's character, at the end of the episode, and there's an artistic choice to keep us just with Juliet and not to have us back in Silo 18, just because, and I'm sure we'll get that next episode in terms of like why they want to keep those two things separate. There's a thematic thing of Juliet's out in the world. And so if you keep cutting back, like, yeah, you could create that tension of like, oh, she's going through all this stuff, but she's alone. But they decided not to do that. I think thematically, it's actually a very strong choice to say that she is off and out and has to figure this out all on her own. And the flashbacks are trying to inform us what she might be thinking in the moments where she's doing it, where she's knocking over, the guardrail to make the bridge and all of that stuff, while also having that sense of isolation and she's alone. So again, I don't know like what I would like fix. That's one of my like things is I feel like I do this too much of like
You're such an
I would do
engineer, Grace. You always
I
are
know.
looking for something to fix, a little
I know.
toy to tweak.
I know. I'd be like, oh, I do this differently. I honestly don't know. Other than that, yeah, I just think the timing of when this event happens, it's unfortunate that it comes after what I think is a very natural conclusion to season one, and then kind of just leaves us in a like spot to start season two.
Well, let's get into the really invigorating opening, I would say, to season two. No matter what your opinion might be about the episode proper, getting to see Silo 17 in the past and probably the darkest image of the series so far, which is perhaps showing a bit of a progenitor as to what might be happening in 18. We see an outright uprising within Silo 17. We see, a group of people kind of like huddled near a mechanical. We find out that the people upstairs are going to flood the generators to kind of like weed them out. So they go in like a full-on assault to basically be like, it's all propaganda. They're lying to us. We're going to go outside. And it's this, again, like bright peak of sunshine, quite literally, and then an immediate cold front in the form of, yeah, they pry open the doors and it's great. They're going to have their huge like migration on and found the world, et cetera, et cetera. And then cut to the present as that green flag that was hoisted in so much hope turns into a metaphoric red one as Juliet walks over a quite literal grave site on her way to Silo 17.
I love this opening. I love how much it adds to the world, because now you think about there being at least 18 silos that might be ripe, and that so much of what in season one that's established is like a lot of the rules and the basically like fascism that's in place is to basically prevent a rebellion. And it's like it's almost like to Bernard and whoever is informing Bernard is like the ends justify the means, in that like we need to do everything we can to limit their freedom and what they know and the information they have in order to prevent the worst case scenario.
Right.
Turns out when
I'm pretty sure like Bernard espouses that to Juliet a little bit towards the end of like, listen, it's a little bit of fascism, but it's fascism for a purpose.
Right. Which then we see like that there is this rebellion, probably partially caused because of the rules and structures that are in place instead of being honest. But it is this incredibly dark reminder of like, yeah, this is what might happen. And I think too, like Juliet is potentially the spark to 18's rebellion, right? And she's now entering this place where this is the aftermath of what happens when there's a rebellion. She walks over the dad who is carrying the flag and has died, is going to enter into a mass grave of corpses that are decomposing and rotting. And even the ones who potentially did survive, like she finds the guy who's been hanged. You presume that that's like he was just left, even if he did survive, he then did not survive. And so I think that that's really poignant in terms of the way in which like all this, like the notion of the show since season 1 has been like, we send people out to clean because it keeps them in line. It shows that like, if you're going to even think about doing this, if you utter that you would want to leave or there's something, or you're going to break status quo, you can go out and clean and you will die. And Juliet is now the first person that Silo 18 has ever seen like not die. And that is going to be Hope. And Hope is very dangerous for Bernard's rule. And I think it's very fitting that it's like Juliet is walking towards and seeing what might end up becoming like what she left behind in Silo 18. So again, thematically, I think there's like some really strong things. It like gives me a little bit of, ironically, hope for what is to come the rest of the season, Mike.
Yeah, and I love this idea because it also indicates maybe how irreversible what Juliet left behind is going to be. That like, listen, there's a lot of characters we care about. The hope is that they don't make the same mistake and decide to frolic outside of the airlock and all asphyxiate. But at the same time, we see this moment where the leader of the rebellion is, hanging out with what I'm assuming is his wife. And she basically says, like, are you sure you want to do this? What if, one of the guys upstairs is lying? And he says, well, we'll die either way, right? They're too far gone. Either they die in the firefight or they at least die sort of on their feet trying to pursue this thing that they've been hoping towards for the past little while. And so it does, to your point, while maybe create some hope as to what's to come in Silo 18, there is now this really bitter taste, and maybe for Juliet as well, as to like what the end results might be. Even if we return to Silo 18, can we put this toothpaste back in the tube? People have seen that the edicts that Bernard has set up, the lies that they have been told, are indeed lies. Is this something that they are going to take kindly, or is it something that's going to end up with blood on everyone's hands at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think the big difference here, like for me, what the most harrowing moment is not, the dad in the flag and in the ground being dead. That's one thing. But in terms of what Silo 18 knows and the people who might be involved in any sort of rebellion in Silo 18 is like Walker knows that like she needed to provide the tape, right? So she knows, and we have people who know about the screen and all of that stuff. So you would think that like the plan in Silo 18 would at least not be just run outside. So that's good. The part that to me is so harrowing about the opening montage is the silos like shoot, like the military, the armed force, like shooting at their own civilians for trying to get by. That to me is like the scarier version of like, that is something that potentially translates to Silo 18. Not so much that I think Walker, if it was like, we're gonna go outside, Walker would be like, don't do that.
Yeah, well, which is also interesting because if I'm remembering correctly, I don't believe weapons are allowed in Silo 18. That they can only be utilized by security, and that they're the only ones that are able to brandish weapons. So unless they want to like improvise some stuff, it could get really bad for the civilians here.
And as a staunch Second Amendment, what is it? What do you guys have down there?
Yeah, we got Second Amendment.
I don't know. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, so that to me is the most like dangerous piece of the opening montage, because you assume that the plan, that they just didn't have enough. They never got down the road of figuring. They just were like, it's like they are more so in the where like Holston and they were where it's like it probably isn't bad outside. It probably is actually super great and fine outside. So we'll just leave, which ultimately is bad. Don't do that. Don't go outside unprotected.
Yes. So I guess let's sort of move chronologically from a certain perspective because I want to talk about the Juliet flashbacks all kind of
Hmm.
bunched together. I mean, to your point, we'll see if they're like diegetic in that is Juliet thinking back to her first days really getting used to mechanical and quite literally getting her feet wet as she's going through this. I'm not entirely sure, but I do think there's some thematic resonance, right? Of like, Juliet's in this brand new world and she's feeling like she's by herself and she has to realize that the only thing that can keep her afloat is not only like her reliance on her own skills but the necessity of human connection as well. So this is, again, feels very losty to me in that it doesn't necessarily feel like it's revealing any huge brand new things about the character. We got a lot about Juliet's backstory and why she fled down to mechanical back in season 1, but this is the start of the meet cute, at least, of her friendship with Shirley.
Yeah, so I don't mind this stuff. I mean, like if you have to sort of pick something that's a flashback, you also I do think like in terms of we wouldn't do this too often, but I do feel like part of I said this about I think maybe House of the Dragon, that actually felt like part of what I found limiting about the show sometimes was that actually it was trying to be very book faithful. And I think
Mm.
there's actually some of that happening here where you could imagine that they could maybe create some more fun stuff, but they maybe don't want to do that here. And so actually I feel like a lot of this stuff, like we're not getting a lot of flashbacks in the book, but in terms of like they're not creating a lot of these ginormous huge differences, so they get stuck there. So yeah, this relationship with Shirley is kind of, I feel like Shirley's a little bit like underdeveloped to a degree in season 1, and so to
Yeah,
get this like
we sort of left mechanical behind with Juliet once she left, and I think of all the characters focused down there, it mainly was Walker. We got a little bit of Knox and Shirley towards the end as they like
mhm.
when Juliet came back down to flee from persecution and everything, and that's the other thing is, and we talked about this last week as well, is that this might be an opportunity to explore some of these characters and how they react to Juliet's
Yeah,
absence. And maybe they're setting up that Shirley might be one of them.
true. So I do think that this is good. There's this idea of like early on, like Juliet is very like she's like yawning when she's there and like keeping you up, and the guy talks about like whether or not like you want to take my shift too. And yeah, she is like she's learning like on the fly here, and so that does translate quite well thematically to being in this new silo, where she's going to have to navigate and learn as she's going. The big difference, obviously, until the end of the episode, that she is quite alone in this. Even the end of the episode would indicate she might be alone in her journey in Silo 17. So
Yeah. Well, at least listen, we get a cameo from, in my opinion, I don't think I've ever expressed this in season 1, but my favorite character on the show, which is Walker, which
yeah,
is Harriet Walter, with maybe not the best advice as a parental figure, but maybe the advice that you need when you're kind of like in the rub dirt in it mechanic in mechanical of like, listen, you need companionship. The most frightful thing you can have is being alone. Also, let's call a spade a spade. Your mother killed herself.
yeah. This is like down in mechanical. We say how things are. I did like this. I don't love her
Just
being
tell it
like
like it is.
these are often my least favorite people. But I did the thing of like we don't say that like, oh, it might not be functioning at its best, something of like that's not the mentality. And I do think you can see that in like there's actually quite a bit of softness to Juliet in terms of who she is when she arrives. I think that it's
Yeah.
like it's a toy that she's gravitating to that doesn't really feel like adult Juliet, which I think does make sense when you know everything. But this is a girl who is not that far removed from her mother having died, having killed herself. So there is this thing that I think you can really see where like adult Juliet gets this sort of like sternness and coldness that I think you can boil down to this episode coming really from Walker and Walker's like viewpoint on life. And you could feel that in season 1 in terms of like she won't accept the sheriff job until they can like shut down the generator to fix it, and like
Yeah.
there's like she doesn't really take no for an answer, and like you're kind of an idiot if you like try to like say that there's any other, like Julie just knows exactly what she needs to do. And I do think this episode, again, I don't think it's anything like totally brand new, but I do feel like it's still, it's building on the stuff that we did know in a way that I think does mostly work.
Yeah, and I think it also is a reminder, right, of how, granted, it was a brief period of time that her and Billings were working together, but they were sort of like the good cop, bad cop, where Juliet did not necessarily have the softest people skills, which, again, it's really interesting to, despite the fact that maybe not a lot was illuminated, I guess it is implied that maybe she gets a bit of that harder edge from someone like Walker, which is like, yeah, you want to survive down here, just get to the point. But there is still a little bit of warmth contained in there as she makes a very personal gesture to Shirley, who initially rebuffs this idea of a toy, but then also kind of takes her down to, again, this area that we're going to be spending a lot of time in season 1 and in Juliet's life. And is going to give her some advice that, again, we're sort of get paid forward here, which is like, whether metaphorically or literally, if you're stranded in the darkness, just move very slowly, but keep on moving.
Yeah. Again, I think that the flashbacks work, but I do think they are mostly in service of what I was saying before, which is that we don't have any narration. There's no one for Juliet to say anything to. So we kind of have to fill in what in a novel would be like her thoughts. And so we need something to give us voice when she's building the bridge, wrapping up her arm, all of that. She just keeps moving forward throughout the silo. I think this episode would feel a lot quieter if we didn't have the flashback scenes. So I feel like, unfortunately, while I do think that they are good, they are out of necessity and not out of I don't know how much they're like super additive.
All right, well, let's talk about what's going on with Juliet in Silo 17. Any thoughts about the initial aesthetics of this place? Again, listen, Grace, you and I covered The Last of Us, very much textbook post-apocalyptic, like overgrowths everywhere, flickering lights. Quite frankly, I'm still surprised lights are on, considering that from that pool of water, it's very clear that the generator was indeed flooded.
Well, is this a place to pop down and maybe plant the flag that guy fell over holding? We'll pick it up. And is this anything? Is the fact that there is some form of electricity? The obvious answer would be, Steve Zahn's character has power, and it therefore is like there are ways in which whatever system he has set up. Like, I think that the fan is one where like she hears this like kind of tinkering and she follows the sound, and it turns out that it's a sort of badge attached to a fan that's sort of clicking. Like, it, to a degree, this show is a mystery box show. I do feel like, I also do feel like it's not, I don't feel like it's fully always trying to be like, trying to make us see things that are not. Like, I think in terms of the mystery, it's not trying to keep a lot of things a mystery. I don't know. I like Bernard, to me, felt like when it was revealed in season 1 that he's a bad guy, I was like yeah, like yeah, sorry, but yeah. Like that was a classic, like he's the first person I would have ruled out. So they got me because I had already ruled him out because he was so obviously the bad guy, and then it turns out to be the bad guy. Like, is there anything to the fact that there is power else? Like, is there anything else happening? Should we be keeping an eye on anything else that's happening in this episode? For me, it feels like no, except for when we meet, the door. But
yeah, yeah, exactly. It seems more to me like Steve Zahn's character Solo is gone full Kevin McAllister, where he's like got everything up and running, and not to age Steve Zahn too much, but we assume that he's been there for at least a little while by himself, but that also provides a lot of other interesting circumstances, because my assumption, at least, Grace, was like, okay, the rebels led their big exodus outside the airlock, but like eventually the door closed. And so what happened to the people that were left behind in there? And like, what horrors did Solo have to endure towards the end of that as people got wiped out around him? Was it really like one clean sweep and he is the sole survivor, or was it like waves of things over and over again? But my Occam's razor is that he just has like everything up and running so he can explore to kind of his heart's content, and that now we have the wet bandits, or I guess the extra dry bandits, in the form of Juliet coming in, and he's trying to set up some things to keep her out.
All I can imagine now is that I know Macaulay Culkin got cast in Fallout Season 2, and I just want him to be
Exactly.
Kevin McAllister
He knows his way around a
in a
vault.
Fallout bunker. That's all I want. Yeah, I think the same thing. I do think that it could have been fun. Again, I'm gonna be like, what could we have fixed here? Which is like, I presume. Do we presume that he's the boy? He's the boy, right?
Well, no, because yeah, you would think that like, okay, it's the boy Tim. I'm fairly sure I saw Tim walk out
Tim.
with his parents into the great
Okay.
unknown. And there is, if you follow the bodies, there is the skeleton
Yeah,
of what
yeah,
looked
yeah,
to be the
yeah.
rebel leader holding the flag, and then right behind him was one larger body kind of holding and shielding a smaller body. So as morbid as I don't want to go here, I'm pretty sure that's the body of Tim, unless he was like, no, Dad,
Well,
I
that
got cold feet and ran back inside.
nope. I think that tracks. So then in my head though, I'm like, not that it has to be like Solo has to be Tim or whatever. And there is a name. We have a name in the book for that character, but
Hmm.
I maybe would have. I mean, the last scene is so good. This is the part that's so hard. Is that the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes are so good that it's almost like there's almost a bit of it's like it's worth it. It was worth it to like hold Steve's on. Like I wonder if there's a version of this where we do like do we get more about like can we get more of like what happened from his point of view? Does that ruin the eventual end
I
of the
mean, I'm
episode? Like
I'm sure we're
probably.
I'm
I'm sure we'll
sure
get
we're
it
gonna
too.
get that. Yeah, like again, we know that Silo is a show, in particular with season one, that likes to just like throw in flashback, considering how we got so much about Juliet's backstory towards the latter half of the season. I will bet you dollars to donuts we will eventually get an opener of a future episode about what happened specifically to Solo and how he was involved in the skirmish.
All right. Well, dollars to donuts. I'll bet one Juliet nickel.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, I mean, it was fun. Again, as I mentioned before, it was fun to see Juliet kind of think her way through these things, and I think her, being able to go into someone's place and like change into their threads, I think is symbolic of like her truly getting acclimated to this as her new home, as much as its current, as much as the landlord doesn't necessarily want her squatting there. It does seem like this episode was kind of set up for us to be introduced to this location through her, as she is going to get more acquiesced and settled into trying to make this place her new home.
It was fun for like 2 minutes, and then we got like 15 minutes worth of it. I feel like, but it is what it is. I can only say so much about what didn't work for me, which is that it didn't feel like it had like it was kind of like the same. It wasn't the same thing, but like the purpose of it was kind of like the same, like to show the skill set that she has, which is that like she can build a bridge or she can wrap, she does find the clothes. Like it's all,
Yeah, I
honestly,
mean, she is quite literally building bridges, while
yeah,
metaphorically she's doing that in the flashback by giving the toy to Shirley.
it's true. You know what? It did feel actually pretty video gamey. When you're like in the
It
new
did.
place of the video game, and I'm the type of person who's like, I'm gonna find everything. I'm gonna find every little chest, every corner, every bookshelf. I'm gonna check it, and that's fine for a video game, but I don't know that it worked as a large chunk of the season premiere of Silo season 2.
Oh
So,
no, it's giving me huge Naughty Dog vibes, Grace. I mean,
mm,
like Last of
yeah,
Us, right? When it's like,
yeah.
hey, Joel, go grab that ladder and bring it over. That's basically what happens with Juliet over that big precarious scene.
There's this really great, I think it's like an Instagram or TikTok, whatever, where the guy's like, it's like he climbs up the ladder, he knocks over the ladder, and he's like, guess you're gonna have to find another way over. He's like, I'll just pick up the ladder. It's like, nope, you can't pick that one up. And it's like joking about it, like, why do video games do this? Of like, the like I gotta find another way around. It's like I could just climb up these barrels. Like you can't climb up those barrels. So yeah, it just was a little drawn out for me. But that's fine. I mean, I can't really be that mad about getting to watch Rebecca Ferguson act on television for,
Yeah.
every week for the next 10 weeks. So
So I was, and I know she has a thing about water, but I was really hoping she would like surf that slab of metal all the way through
mhm,
until it became a bridge.
yes, no, she
Go
did not
full
do that.
Teen Wolf.
Yeah. So yeah, we get Juliet improvising, MacGyvering, I think is how you said it earlier. That's the
Exactly.
best way to
Yeah.
put it. Yeah.
Well, let's get to our ending here. Let's not draw things out. Let's talk about the appearance of Steve Zahn's highly anticipated character Solo here. As yes, Juliet falls for the old badge claptrapping against the fan ruse, and she thinks that, like, remember, the whole reason why she builds these improvised bridges is because she thinks that there is somebody on the other side that she can actually communicate with. And also remembering Juliet's headspace, like, yes, there is this huge gargantuan discovery she made that fundamentally shifts the way that she thinks about the world, but also she has been exiled from everything she knows and loves. That's got to be a lot to deal with, and this is when she needs that human connection. So you could kind of see the hope leave her face a little bit as she realizes, like, okay, that wasn't anything. And then she hears some music. She hears Moon River. And unfortunately, the guy playing it does not want to have breakfast either at Tiffany's or anywhere, as she will find Solo himself inside of a vault. And he will speak to her, basically saying, like, oh, good, you listened to the music. By the way, it wasn't an invite. I guess it was just for me to give this message. Good on you for being super nosy and being attracted to noises and doors. But consider this your final warning. If you do it again, I'm going to kill you. And that's how we end the episode. And the only thing we see so far are just his, like, menacing yet still kind of panicked bug eyes. And anything I could have possibly anticipated from Steve Zahn getting to play this character almost bore out within these 3 lines, because it was textbook Steve Zahn delivery, in my opinion.
I heard they did in-person auditions where they just had that door, and then people stood and they were like, Steve Zahn, he's perfect, so we'll cast him. I love this. I think it's so good. It's so, and you know, I wonder whether, if I think the episode is so much better, whether, like, does this work a little bit less than it did, but it's like, oh my gosh, finally something that I'm really loving. I don't know, but nevertheless, I thought this was tremendous. I think it's so good. It actually, to me, I feel like one of the reasons that I find Silo, not only that I think the show is good, but I think it has a very good elevator pitch. Ironically, they don't use
elevators. Yeah.
Elevators. But I feel like, you know, you and I get asked all the time, is like, what should I watch? What are you watching? What's good? What should I be watching? And like, there's a few shows every once in a while where, like, even as much as I love Severance has a little bit of like it's like, okay, so there's people at work, and then at work they don't remember what's going. You know, it's hard. Whereas like Silo is like, all these people are stuck in a silo, they don't know why, and they can't leave. And to me, that's great. And I feel like this is a very natural, you know, forward momentum mystery box element of the show. Is like, there's a guy behind the door who doesn't want people to go behind the door. And like, Mike, you and I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. Put something behind a door, you filled a 3-hour session of D&D with your players. Probably even more. I feel like this is it's just perfect. He says just enough. And I, like, my earlier thing of like, maybe we should have got more Steve Zahn. Like, I'm wrong. That was wrong, actually, because this is the perfect way to introduce him right at the end of the episode. This is, as much as I think they should have dropped 2 episodes, this is also so fun to wait a week for now, see how this, like, what happens here. Like, Juliet can't go anywhere else. The rest of the place does not seem terribly, you know, hospitable. And to your point earlier about like, why might, you know, I asked why might some of the stuff be working? It probably is that he could go and traverse when he needed to. And so he's probably picked over this thing clean. So this is a really fun place to like stop down. And it's just, it works because it's Steve Zahn. The idea of Steve Zahn and Rebecca Ferguson are extremely fun to think about them playing off of each other.
Like, it's going to be such a great, like, straight man, crazy man dynamic where, like, I think he's going to be, especially considering he has been isolated for some considerable time, I think he's going to be his usual zany Steve Zahn self. And Rebecca Ferguson is just going to have to, like, give him so much face back, you know, basically give him nothing, but give him everything. And that she's going to have to react and interact alongside this, because it actually counters really nicely to the flashbacks where she is able to extend this attempt at connection with Shirley, and it ends up working. Here she's like, oh great, a friend to play with, and he's like, I don't want to play with you.
Well, there's 2 very fun things here, which is one, I think, is that, like, I think the flashback, actually, this might be an episode that we'll appreciate much more as we go along, because if you think about part of what this episode is like Juliet making a friend and finding connection. And that is a skill that she had. And even in season 1, she had with Holston, and Lucas is somebody, and obviously like, you know, Walker being her mother figure, that like, you think that she does have this ability probably to figure out how to tap in. And there might be a way to like figure out the puzzle of Steve Zahn's character to the point where she can unlock what she presumably would want to do, which is how can I help the people in Silo 18? And then what else is going on, and how can we figure out what else is going on? And he at least says seemingly might have the resources to be able to do that. He just might not be interested in doing it, and she's
Right.
going to have to try to, break down the door of both the physical door that's in front of her, and then also his, the walls that he has put up. And to me,
Yeah.
that's an incredibly exciting place to head into this season with.
Could she just do what she did for the airlock? Take that like crowbar, her trusty
Yeah.
new tool, and just pry it open with her body weight?
Well, yeah, yeah. The lanyard from the thing it probably just opens the door right away. The
Yeah,
lanyard
I'd
from
also
the
say
fan.
pretty faulty airlock if like it's supposed to be that no force can get in without any sort of code or like extreme amount of strength. I mean, Juliet, as we know, is incredibly jacked beyond all belief and very good at what she does, but
Mhm.
I don't know. I guess maybe it's also one of those things where it's like taking the lid off a jar of pasta where like
Yeah,
it's so hard to do the first time and then
yeah,
after
yeah.
that it gets considerably easier.
And these haven't been managed or maintained in
Yeah.
X number of years. Yeah.
Last
Mhm.
thing I want to do, Grace, let's plant our green flag here. What episode number do we see Solo's full face? That we don't get Steve Zahn as Wilson from Home Improvement and like only a part of him.
Um, uh, Unfortunately, my guess is episode 3. I think that probably if we're right or wrong, like whether or not they were going to release 2 episodes or not, it does seem, even if they knew all along that this is what episode 1 would be and was going to be released, no pun intended, solo, I guess pun intended. It does seem like I do think there's thematic reasons to do that, and that season 2 might be a return to the silo. I feel like the only way I would like hedge my bets and feel like what I would recommend you to take is that like we return there by the end of next episode. But otherwise, I think we might be waiting 2 weeks to get any sort of Solo and Juliet, any more of that content.
I might take the over here. I'm gonna say
Oh,
4.
more.
I
Wow.
I mean, I think that this show it's interesting because I wouldn't say it's slow paced, despite maybe some of the critiques that are levied towards this episode. I think it's very uniquely paced, and I'm not sure what Juliet's next moves are. Right, like obviously she is going to heed his warning. She understandably should, but like if we go back there for episode 3, is she going to spend the entire time just like trying to create a sustainable life for herself? And if so, then maybe either episode 3 ends or episode 4 begins with like him
Very
stepping out of the
interesting.
vault being like, that's not how you grow a tomato. I'll show you how to do it.
Very interesting. I kind of like that in terms of like really keeping, again, this is what I was saying about this episode 1 and episode 2, where it's like Juliet in Silo 17, and then episode 2 will be Silo 18, is this world where like to really like drive home this point of the isolation, like never even show us Steve Zahn, have him be behind the door. His only ever appears through the slot hole. It's very fun. I really like thinking about television in that way, of like the choices they can make that are almost like, if you're watching this more casually, you might not notice. Like we're talking about the end of the Penguin episode, where there's a scene where like the 2 characters are like, one's really high and one's really low. And those are the things that obviously, like when you think about how much work goes into television, they are thinking about. It's why I feel almost bad being like, I think this episode was pretty boring, because I do think that there was a ton of thought put into this episode, and this is the choice that they decided to make, and one that I arguably would say like, I don't know how you do it differently, because of just the stuff we have to get to, and the eventual payoff of this last scene is so good because we've only been with Juliet this whole episode. So yeah.
Well, seemingly next week, to your earlier point, we're going to go back over that hill and we are going to look at everything that's going on with Silo 18. I'm very excited because despite the situation and the location, we have a lot of places we could go, whether it's dealing with Bernard's immediate reaction to it now as sort of the de facto mayor, whether it's someone like Sims, who, as we talked about in our previous episode, like is obviously in the inner circle, but didn't know necessarily the big twist going on with the screens. We have everything going on all the way down in mechanical, and like, could things get back to Walker as well? She could be in a fair amount of trouble if it gets back to, if people find out that she was the one that supplied the tape to help save Juliet. There's a lot of really interesting things to pick up on with all these different characters. I'm really excited to check all that out next week alongside you, Grace, and hopefully aside all of you as well. Let us know your thoughts. If you are responding in the comments of the YouTube video, I talked about this last podcast. I would just caution people to try to either avoid explicit spoilers from the book or try to put, some ample space around them so that those who have not read the books can click away if need be. We're trying to keep this, in a relatively good spot for people who have either checked out the source material or not. I mean, the good news about Silo is that it fairly deviates from a lot of the source material, and we don't want to necessarily close that vault door on anyone who might be speculating about future events, but, try to keep it cute, people, if you will. But we'd love to hear from all of you. Again, make sure you go to WeKnowScriptedTV.com to subscribe to not only coverage of Silo, which will be coming into your eyes and ears every Friday, but also all the other stuff going on this network, including Grace's coverage of Dune Prophecy. Do you want to just quickly plug what that show is about and how it might fall into the wheelhouse of people who like Silo?
Yeah, so set 10,000 years before the Dune movies by Denis Villeneuve. So set in that same universe, but 10,000 years apart. So you don't even really have to have watched the Dune movies, although they're amazing, so you should watch them. And
I would say watch them to get a feel as to whether or not you like this universe.
That's true. I would say that the one thing that I think that Dune has that I really loved about the movie that I saw some people be off put by it in the first one is it really doesn't try to hold your hand in terms of. I heard in the 1984 Dune, when people would go to the movie theater, they were literally given like a glossary of all the terms in the movie. Does not happen anyone, so it very much is it's immersive in a way that sometimes feels not fun if you really I personally love it. I felt that it was more for me to explore and figure out, and I feel like the show is probably an extension of that, where we're gonna focus on the Bene Gesserit, who are the precursor for the Jedi, which a lot of Star Wars was taken directly from Dune, so Tatooine, planets, all that stuff. And the Bene Gesserit basically seemingly have some mind control powers, things like that they can do, and very different, all women in the Bene Gesserit. And we're going to start we're going to be 10,000 years before the movie, and seeing basically how the beginning of their society started. It is based on a book, but I don't think it's not like they're directly adapting. They're it's almost like the book influenced the show that's coming when they wrote the series. So I'm very excited. A really great cast. So yeah, Taryn, Josh, and I will be chatting about that each week and recapping each individual episode.
All right, looking forward to checking it out, Grace. I hope everyone else is as well as our continual coverage of Silo. It is great to be back now officially with some new Silo to talk about, as next week we check out whatever the hell's going on in Silo 18 following all the calamity that ended season 1. Thank you all so much for listening. Until next week, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.